Okay. Welcome to Tech Tuesday, number 28. And we will start with a moment of silence. Still have an ongoing hostage situation, and we have not yet forgotten the atrocities. Okay, today we're going to talk about drugs and devices. As you know, I'm the head of the medical device department, emphasis on the word device. And drugs are done in a different department. And in general, drugs and devices are considered to be very different fields of IP. How so? The technology is different, the predictability is different, and the patent attorneys are different. Different people that do it. And what I want to talk about today is that sometimes they come together naturally, and sometimes they're ignored. And in fact, it was 28 years ago when a patent attorney from a different firm brought to my attention that I was writing patents on a device and I was completely ignoring the interaction between the device and the drugs. Well, not completely ignoring, but substantially ignoring. I'd like to compare drugs and devices just so we understand how different they are. So in drugs, there's a very high risk that you won't have a drug. It takes a long time to develop. The actual drug is quite close to its final design pretty early in the process. The number of patents on the drug are usually low. And maybe the most interesting part is that the predictability requirement on drugs are very high. You can't get a patent just because you gave a name of a drug. Now let's look at devices. Devices are risky, but the overall risk is medium. Development time is usually shorter. The finality is middle towards the end of the process. Side effects are different. Predictability requirements are different. The number of direct patents that directly cover the product that you're selling is relatively high. Less attention needs to be given to secrets on how you manufacture. Regulation is less difficult. And very interesting, I have something called high touch. When you implant a device in a person, that's it. You don't interact with it anymore. People walk around with plates, orthopedic plates, and they don't think about it. A drug, often you take every day or get an injection once a week. It's very high touch. There's always something going on. One last point. There are things that are not drugs, but they act like drugs. Electrical stimulation, sometimes called electroceuticals. Okay? Let's say I developed a particular pulse sequence that when you electrify the bottom of your feet, it improves kidney function. It's not easy to develop. The way that the electricity interacts with the body is closer to drugs. Issues of dosage and what is the best way to deliver, also similar to drugs. Like electrical stimulation, you have radiation treatments, you have ultrasound, I'm talking about therapeutic ultrasound. You have light-based therapies. All of them are not a chemical, not a biological, but with regard to how they're used are quite close to drugs. And there's movement therapy, having people move different parts of their body in different ways. Again, it has many things similar to drugs. For example, it's very high touch. The patient has to do it every day, often. And therefore you have adherence problems. People just don't do it, just like people just don't take drugs. And the whole issue of dosing and personalization is similar to what you have in drugs. Anybody who has used a personal trainer knows what I'm talking about. Okay, this is not a list of all the devices that can work with drugs, but this is just a few examples of devices that interact with drugs when they're doing whatever they're doing. A catheter, a CT imager, yes, you have contrast material. A stent, people have drug-eluting stents. A pacemaker, pacemakers are usually given at the same time that the patient is getting drugs. All sorts of tools used inside the body use drugs in order to make them work better. And traditionally, most of these devices, when you think about them, you think about the electronics or the mechanics. You don't think about how they're going to interact with drugs. But together is better. And let me give you a few examples, which I'll develop in a minute. You can have a clinical synergy between the device and the drug, meaning they work together to make the patient better. You can have technological synergy, meaning one helps the other work. Sometimes use a combination for marketing. You can use it for extending IP protection. Anybody who hasn't forgotten, patents tend to expire after 20 years, and if you're really, really lucky, 25 years. And when you talk about IP protection or an IP portfolio more generally, there's a synergistic interaction between the drug patents, the device patents, and the drug device patents. Now, of all of the things that modern technologies, I think the most problematic are actually drugs. You take a chemical, you give it to a patient, it interacts with multiple parts of the patient in ways that are not really known, and you're trying to cure a very specific disease. Now, IP loves having problems, because if you have a problem, there's a solution. If you have a solution, there's going to be a patent. But drugs are very, very slow to develop, meaning if I develop a drug and it has a side effect, we're not going to come to market with an improved drug 3 years later. We could come to market with a device within 3 years, which will pick up the slack and help solve the problems of the drugs. So if we talk about drugs, here's some problems. They're difficult to manufacture, difficult to deliver, difficult to make sure they're actually what they're supposed to be. They might not be compatible with the patient. They interact with other drugs. They have side effects. You have no idea what dosage to use. It's difficult to store. People don't like taking them. And because drugs often have a small number of patents, those patents are very sensitive. And when they die, you have an expiration cliff. Suddenly, all of your competition can come in and compete. So each one of these lines is a place where you have problems, and the solution is more quickly using a device and not using a drug. But if I file a patent on a device that helps me deal with drug-drug interactions, maybe prevent them, maybe monitor them more carefully, then that device on its own is less valuable than together with the drug. So here's some examples of clinical synergy. I can have a device and the device has side effects, so I give a drug to prevent these side effects. I can have a device which treats the side effect of drugs. I'm giving a patient a drug, it has a side effect. I have a device which treats these side effects. More interesting, perhaps, is a drug and device working together. Let's imagine that we have a drug-eluting stent. A drug-eluting stent means you put in the stent to hold the blood vessel open, but you have a drug on the stent which prevents the blood vessels from growing back in. You could also consider it to be a side effect of the device, because the device itself is what causes the blood vessel to constrict. Sometimes you have a drug which allows the device to work. If you have an implant, and when you have the implant, let's say a pacemaker lead, when you attach a pacemaker lead to the heart reacts by generating a fibrosis layer near the lead. That fibrosis layer reduces the conduction of electricity from the pacemaker lead into the heart. If you have a lead which elutes steroids, for example, you can prevent that fibrosis from forming, and that will allow the device to work. Sometimes if you have a device, you can reduce the drug dose. Easiest place to look at it is in pain medication. If you stabilize an injured organ, you can use less drug in order to end pain. A device is very commonly used to improve localization where the drug is given, to improve the pharmacodynamics and the pharmacokinetics. And I'm not going to go into that, but it can be done. Patient selection. How do I know which patient to give the device? Well, sometimes I give a drug. Depending how the patient reacts, I know which device to use. Sometimes I use imaging, which is a device, in order to know whether to use a drug. If I want to personalize a drug, and I'll have the opposite example later, but having a device tells me how well the drug is working, so I know what dosage to use and when. In any case, all of this list are items that people, and by people I mean, for example, patent attorneys, usually are aware of, and they file IP to cover all of these things. Okay, if the client is using automated syringe in order to time the delivery of the drug, it's probably going to file a patent on that. Now we have technological synergy. Some drugs are difficult to use, and technology can make them easier to use. And here's, if we talk only about delivery, here's a list of different ways of delivery. Each and every one of them have filed IP for. What if you have a drug where you have a very complex dosage method? You're supposed to take more if your heart rate is high and less if your heart rate is low, responsive to your blood pressure after the food, before the food, not too late at night in order to avoid side effects. Okay, the dosing can be very complicated, and of course a computer, which is a device, can help you do it. Personalization of drugs. Some drugs are actually personalized using a machine. So if you think about immune-based biologics, you have a machine. Sometimes you have a person involved, but there is a machine which modifies whatever it is they're going to give the patient. Closing a feedback loop. You're giving patient insulin. So an insulin pump can measure your glucose levels and give you insulin according to what you need. So the insulin can be a novel drug, and they have novel insulins, and the device allows that drug to be used more easily because you don't need the patient to prick their finger, look at the result, and change their dose. Sometimes the IP guide doesn't quite understand the specific interaction, the technological synergy between the drug and the device. So let's talk about insulin pump, for example. Any patent attorney writing a patent on an insulin pump will understand that you want to give insulin only when you need, but they might not be quite aware of all the different side effects and different types of insulin and how those would affect the algorithms you would have in the pump. Same way, if somebody invents a new type of insulin, like delayed release, are they really aware of how that affects the technology found inside the pump? The answer is often not. Marketing and sales. So from all the examples I gave, it's clear that some of the advantages of using a drug can require using a device. And perhaps in general, treating a patient in modern days requires a lot of technology, some of the drug and some of the technology and something else. But that's what you're selling. You're selling treating the patient. Now, if you have a device, what a device can do, which is much more difficult to do using a drug, is bringing together the buyer, which could be the HMO, the patient, and the prescribing physician. If you only have a pill that you're taking, the patient will meet the physician once every few months, and the physician will prescribe the drug, and the buyer will pay for it, but the buyer doesn't really know if the drug is being taken, if the drug works. But if you have a device, and let's talk about a pacemaker, for example, or an implanted blood pressure monitor, which is not a common device. This device is always sending out data. The patient sees the data, the physician sees the data, and the person paying for everything can also get, if they want, real-time data explaining how these different things work together. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of tying and bundling, but basically the idea is that I sell you bread together with chocolate spread, and I can sell it at a lower price because I can do less marketing, and you buy it because you like making sliced bread with chocolate spread on it. It turns out, well, traditionally that's done in a business manner, but you can also use IP in order to tie together the two things. Just imagine a kit that has chocolate, spread, and bread in one package. Now, why would you want to do it? The answer is antitrust. Bundling is often used by a monopolist in order to force out competitors. If anybody here remembers, Microsoft used to have a browser called Microsoft Explorer, and they put it into their operating system for free. Okay, I mean, the operating system costs money. That's bundling. Now, if somebody wants to compete with Microsoft, it's much more difficult because everybody who has a Windows computer already has Microsoft Explorer, and it's already the default, and it's already integrated into the system. So Europe required Microsoft to debundle them. But imagine if Microsoft was doing the bundling using IP. Now, you might still have antitrust problems, and there's a famous case having to do with antipsychotics. Antipsychotic drugs have a problem. Every so often, they cause severe damage to your blood, which can kill the patient. So people don't want to prescribe them. So this company, Sandoz, was selling a bundle that had the drug and a service which tested the patient for blood problems often enough to prevent it. And it's questionable whether or not that's an antitrust problem, but I believe that if they would have bundled it using IP, You might know that IP is often considered to be an exclusion from antitrust. It's very complicated. I'm not advising, I'm just pointing it out. In any case, since you are treating a patient and the product can be treatment of the patient, you can bundle multiple technologies in one product and protect it using IP, because using product component A together with component B together with component C might better treat the patient than just doing each one separately. Let's look for a second at sales. Devices and drugs, because they appeal to different parts of society and also different ones of the buyer and the patient and the physician, enter the sales funnel at different points, or they enter different funnels, and in any case, they allow you to develop new ways of engaging the client. Usually you want to avoid cannibalization, that people shouldn't use your device instead of the drug, but I think that is usually not a problem. Usually the benefit of being able to reach a larger market by having more contact points overcomes it, and by having IP on the combination of the drug and the device, you can perhaps block the competition from taking advantage of exactly these options. Money, okay? Companies want to make money. By having both a device and a drug, you have multiple ways of collecting money. Different markets might need different ways. Mm-hmm. If I give you a pacemaker, you're going to pay a lump sum. If I give you a drug, you're going to pay every time you buy a pill. If I treat you together and have IP which prevents the competition from treating a disease with a combination of a pacemaker and that drug, what I have is the option of deciding whether I'm going to charge the patient more on the lump side or more on the ongoing. Drugs are usually inherently disposable, and devices can include a service component. Gives me the option of charging using SaaS models. One of the big problems, and anybody who's watched TV in the US knows, is how do you convince patients to use a drug? The answer is you show them ads, and the ad says at the end, after you see everybody, before the end, at the end they say it's going to kill you. But before that, they show you pictures of happy people walking around using the drug, and they say, talk to your physician about it. We have a little bit of that here in Israel too. Having a device allows you to have more options for communication. And what that means is you can highlight a benefit or a value. And I know perhaps this goes more into sales. On the other hand, not to forget, if you have both a drug and a device and there's different ways of charging money, it's easier for the money to leak away from you. So people need to work harder. So here's a classic use. I have a device that tracks drug use and collects the money. The device can be connected to the person who's paying, and the drug is connected to the person who's taking the pill. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the skinny label litigation, but summarize it in one sentence. A second medical use patent might not be as powerful as it once was in the US, because your generic competitor can put on a skinny label which doesn't talk about the new indication, the new use, and then perhaps the non-infringing. But if you have a device and you have IP on using the device together with the drug, and more important, if the device is also somehow connected to what the drug is doing, then not only can you perhaps justify a higher cost, it makes it much more difficult for the competition to say, oh, you can just buy any generic drug and use it, because the generic drug doesn't know how to work with your device. Temporal extension. Okay, I mentioned the IP expiration cliff. Luckily for companies making drugs, there are very strong habits on how people use a drug and when they use it and so on. And IP can be used to cover these habits. Now, if the drug is invented in the year 2020 and comes to the market in the year 2030, these habits might only be identified in the year 2028. So we could get protection all the way to 2048, an extension of 8 years perhaps, and as time goes on, more, by covering the habits that people are using your drug with. Drug usage means data, and if we have collected data, we can build a device. The device can be enforcing correct patient selection, dosage, usage, drug delivery, any one of these. They're all protectable, and they all extend the effective monopolies that you get. The very fact that you have a drug and people have devices, let's talk about implants, means that how the drugs work together with the device is better explored, which means we can file patents for second medical use. Now, I'm not going to talk about clinical type patents, whatever that is, but I do want you to consider that once development of the device is completed, the only way you're going to get more protection is the same way people get protection for a drug, that once the development is completed, you have a problem that one day the patent will expire. Most interesting, if you have a company and they have a patent portfolio, perhaps for protection, you want to have a balance of different types of IP. Broad IP, narrow IP, IP on yourself, IP on other people, early maturing IP, late maturing IP, protection for people using other drugs. By having both device IP and drug IP, you can get a much more balanced portfolio. Let me just give you an example. Like I said, drug development has a certain shape, and during part of that period, you don't expect any R&D to happen on the drug. People are working too hard to push that drug through clinical trials. What you can do is get new protection for device aspects of the drug-device combination. The data availability, the data that you have, can feed into much faster device development cycle and device FDA cycles. It's true that some devices take many years to get approved, but in general, much less than drugs. You need to have a balanced portfolio because there are multiple ways of failure. It gives you more ways to block the competition, which basically means that that cliff that I showed you in the previous slide is not as stiff. It gives you more ways to expand the direction the company is going. And perhaps it can be used to block or monetize all sorts of types of off-label use. So all this stuff is wonderful, so why don't we do it every day, all day? First of all, I think there's a lack of awareness of the complexity of the other fields. Device people think, oh, it's a pill, you just take the pill in the morning, you know, that's it. No. It's way more complicated. Often there's no product view. The IP person or the client look at what they're doing as a technology instead of looking at the patient as the field. If you have a startup and they're trying to develop a new drug, they don't even think about the device problems because they assume that they're trivial, and they might be trivial, but even if they're trivial, we could still get good protection for them. Imagine a new drug that has to be implanted in the body using a very particular needle design. It might be trivial to develop that needle, but nobody did it before because nobody had to inject that drug to that particular part of the body. It would have been nice to have protection. Collecting data is not easy because when a company does experiments, they do it as narrow as possible, and they're not going to collect the information which will help the other type of technology. Of course, I just want to note that when you file a patent on drug-device combination, what you can and should file before clinical work looks different from what you file after clinical work. So you really need to do both. And there's often a challenge which people prefer to ignore on how to force patients to use the device and the drug together. And no matter how it's solved, there's often IP in how that's solved. But like I said, each company says, if I build this drug, the world will be wonderful. If I build this device, the world will be wonderful. And the need for a combination and this specific challenge of forcing the users to use them both together, that's less aware. So to repeat perhaps what I said before, who files and who doesn't file these patents. So most companies aren't aware that they're in the solution business. Sometimes they buy whatever technology they don't have from somebody else. Imagine a drug company buying syringe technology. But they buy it and they think they're done. If you are a clever device company and you invented a new type of syringe, then you might identify particular drugs or drug companies which have a synergy with your syringe, and then you would file suitable IP which covers a drug-device combination. I've seen drug companies, when they do develop or buy a delivery technology, they focus on how that delivery technology is good for their particular drug. But they don't think more generally than that. I mean, sometimes. So, summarize everything. The question is not if you should file a drug device patent, but how. How can the device IP and the drug IP somehow enhance your portfolio? And what I suggest to do is you look for the various types of vulnerabilities in the business and in the IP to identify where IP could be helpful. I gave a long list of examples, and there are many more if you look in the patent office, and that can perhaps inspire you to find specific IP which it could be useful. And by specific IP, I don't mean an invention, I mean a direction, after which you have to invent or research or experiment in order to be actually able to file that patent. And here's a story. It sounds crazy, but there's a drug, and you have to take the doses between 4 and 6 hours apart, but not right after food and not right before exercise. And there are quite a few drugs like this that are even commonly taken, and because users are not aware, they get suboptimal, for example, pain drugs. So obviously, they develop software that helps the patient to take the drug. The question is, what kind of claims should they write? And more interesting, how will having patent claims be helpful for their business? And here's an example to tide you over. One out of many. It's a company that prints QR codes on drug packages. You have an app, you take a picture of the QR code, and it automatically generates reminders. It doesn't keep track of all the other stuff. Okay, I am stopping the recording.